I'm really privileged to have Anthony Stadlen here. He's done so many things. I will leave him to introduce himself.
Well, thank you. I'm very honoured that you have invited me to address this distinguished company. And my name is Anthony Stadlen. I have been a psychotherapist for really quite a long time. I started practicing back in 1971, and I've been practicing continuously since then. I've done a few other jobs, I won't bore you with them. And since 1996, I've been putting on my own seminars, roughly one a month. All days, one Sunday a month, of the inner circle seminars in which I try to fathom the foundations, if there are any, of psychotherapy, what the hell it's all about, because I felt confused myself about what you might call the foundations of what we were doing. I actually did the first seminar on the exact centenary of when Freud presented two important things to the Society of Neurology and Psychiatry in Vienna on April the 21st, 1896. So the centenary happens to be a Sunday the 21st of April, 1996. So I put on this all-day seminar about Freud's seduction theory, and it was also the first time that he had actually presented the name psychoanalysis in public. He had written it in an article in French a few months earlier, but the first time he'd actually spoken it, as far as we know, in public or to his colleagues, psychiatrists, and neurologists. He himself was a neurologist, not a psychiatrist. First time he actually used the word psychoanalysis as his kind of trademark for his sort of psychotherapy. Now, today, Del asked me if I would talk, and he suggested that I might talk a bit about Daseinsanalysis, which is a development of psychoanalysis. This was something in which I had been interested from even before I started actually practicing as a psychotherapist. I had been interested in, I'd read Freud since I was 16. I bought The Interpretation of Dreams by Freud, was fascinated by it, but I think I was morally corrupted by it, in all seriousness, because of Freud's psychologizing of ethics, which is extremely confusing if you actually take him seriously. And I was a very serious young man, and so unfortunately I took him very seriously. And I think this was extremely confusing. But at the same time, I found psychoanalysis fascinating, and I sought psychoanalysis for myself when I was 22. God knows what I might have, what sort of swamp I might have found myself in, but I was fortunate enough just to end up with Dr. Aron Esterson, who was one of the two analysts in Britain who called themselves existential analysts. One was R.D. Laing, and the other was his colleague Aron Esterson. And I therefore plunged into the existential literature, augmenting the psychoanalytic literature that I had known previously. And I found it very enlightening and enthralling. And quite early on, still probably around about 1962 or early 1963, I came across a review in the British Journal of Medical Psychology by R.D. Laing. I was looking for for reviews and articles by him. And it was a review of this book, The Analysis of Dreams by Medard Boss. And it was a very lively review, and he made it sound like a very lively book. He said that it took Heidegger for granted, took Heidegger as read, and but he said Boss lacked the painstaking discipline of his master Heidegger, so that Boss was rather brash and rash at times, and Lang actually thought that Boss was getting himself into a rather contradictory position in which he was actually approaching the statement that there was actually no way of distinguishing between dreams and waking life, which Lang thought was absurd. I mean, going back to Heraclitus was, 2005 years ago, was quite clear that there's a fundamental difference between dream and waking life, namely in dreams we're in our own world, and in waking life we're in a shared world. And this is something fundamentally different between dream and waking, although but Boss was fond of quoting an anecdote by the ancient Chinese writer Huang Tse, if I'm pronouncing him rightly, who said, "Last night I dreamt I was a butterfly, but now that I think I'm a man, do I know that I'm a man who dreamt about a butterfly? Or last night was I, or am I actually now a butterfly dreaming that I'm a man?" So Boss liked this very much. But in fact, as time went on, and even in this book itself, he does give a fairly clear distinction between what dreams and what waking life actually are. And one of the distinctions he makes, which I think he probably got from Heidegger, though it's not quite clear who actually put it like this, but one of the distinctions is that when we awake from sleep or from a dream, we call it awakening, and we awaken into the shared world that Heraclitus talked about. But not only that, we awaken into the same world that we were in when we fell asleep. But when we fall asleep and dream, we don't necessarily, or perhaps we don't at all, or ever, actually do what Boss calls a dreamen, corresponding to awaken. We don't sort of a dreamen into the same dream world that we were in the last time we dreamt. I mean, occasionally we might sort of think, oh God, well, here I am again in the same predicament. But generally speaking, there isn't this continuity between our dream life that there is between our different days of waking life. It's part of the very quality of our waking life, I think, or certainly my waking life, that each time I wake up, I feel I have awoken into the same waking world that I was in yesterday or when I fell asleep. I don't know if there's anybody here who has a different experience. No? I mean, speak up if you do. Right. So one of the things, I mean, I was curious about what led Lang to say, despite all his reservations about Boss's recklessness, as he called it, he nevertheless said this was an extraordinary, remarkable book. And I had been curious. I couldn't get a hold of a copy for 3 years. I was curious about what it was that he found so fascinating about the book. And indeed, I did find, I began to see, or quite quickly saw what it was that he thought was very unusual. It's radically different from Freud's and Jung's accounts of dreams. And to me, it was, I can only describe it as a sort of breath of fresh air. I mean, subsequently, and especially recently, I've been developing some criticisms of it, and possibly I was a bit naive in being so enthusiastic about it to begin with. But to give you some idea of what it was that excited me about it, at the center of the book, there's a dream of a lady, 32 years of age, mentally and physically healthy. She had set herself the task of making as complete a record as possible of all her dreams immediately upon waking, even in the middle of the night. She decided to add nothing that she hadn't actually experienced in the dreams, nor to omit anything simply because it appeared to be too unimportant, too meaningless, too absurd, too far-fetched, or too unseemly. This woman had a more than average intelligence and a great natural ability for introspection, and above all, an undeviating sense of truthfulness. For economic reasons, it had been impossible for her to become a trained psychologist or philosopher. She remembered almost all her dreams very clearly on waking, and therefore considered it impossible for her dream experiences to be falsified subsequently and unwittingly by her waking consciousness. This, at least, is what she replied when I expressed Havelock Ellis's fears in this respect. Tonight, I had a strange dream of an urn, this woman reported to me on the 3rd of August, 1950. At first, I dreamt that I was sitting at the dinner table with my husband and children. The table was in our dining room, which I'd made even more cozy by moving the sideboard. I felt safe and peaceful in this room, which was so dear to me. On the walls, I could see the really good pictures which my husband loved to collect. In the windows, I could see flowers, and in front of me, the very attractively set table. On it was a lovely beefsteak with roast potatoes and a juicy lettuce. I can still feel the seductive odor of the roast beef pleasantly tickling my nose, and the mere thought of the delicious juiciness of the lettuce still makes my mouth water. Greedily, I took one bite after another, for I was very hungry. I was fully absorbed in eating, and my husband and my children were tucking in as well. Do you remember, I asked my husband a little while later, that we had exactly the same menu on the first day of our honeymoon in Cannes? He confirmed it with a smile, adding it was exactly a year ago. In the dream, I wasn't in the least disturbed by this ridiculous assertion and by the fact that our children, 5 and 6 years old, were sitting at the table. We'd actually been married for 10 years. Indeed, I was fully convinced that my husband was right, and I replied, I feel as if it had only been yesterday. I then thought quietly of those happy days. At the same time, I was grateful for the happiness of today. I looked at my husband and my children, and I felt extremely fond of them and very near to all of them, especially to my eldest son. While he had originally been sitting in his usual place at the opposite corner of the table, he was suddenly and strangely transported right next to me. In the dream, it didn't appear strange that he'd suddenly changed places without any movement on his or anybody else's part. It was quite reasonable. Nor did it strike me as peculiar that while I was sitting so happily amongst my family, there suddenly appeared colourful bridges reminiscent of very bright rainbows. They extended across the table between me and my family. A large and golden urn hovered on these bridges between us, and particularly near my favourite son. And it goes on, she starts wondering and worrying whether they really will carry on being so happy because maybe the Russians will invade, kill them all. And then she starts planning a hiding place in the garage. But I'm not going to go into that. What I'm concerned with today is particularly this dream of sitting at the dining room table with her family and with these rainbow bridges from her to her children, to her 2 children, and this golden urn which is hovering over the rainbow bridges. Now, in the following pages, Boss goes through all the possible dream experts he can think of the 20th century up till then. And I mean, this book was published in German in 1953. So it's basically from Freud through Jung, Adler, Maeder, Binswanger, Ilassi, through many, many dream experts. And he sort of speculates about what these how these dream experts might have interpreted or responded to this dream. And having gone through them all, he then asks, is there really any evidence for any of these dream theories? And he criticizes each one in terms of various faults that he finds in them. In particular, symbolism, and he ends up with this criticism of interpretations in terms of symbolism, which is really what I was so impressed with. He says, why did our dreamer see a wonderful golden urn hovering above a colorful and rainbow-like bridge between herself and her family, and particularly near her favorite son? Did the dream urn express symbolically and in vivid imagery her own heart going out to build golden rainbow bridges between her and her family, as she herself thought afterwards? And Boss argues, the translation here is bad. It says, it could not be said that our dreamer belonged to the shut-in, retiring type of human being. That's a mistranslation. That's not what Boss says in the original. What Boss says in the original is something about all human beings, not just this dreamer. He's saying that human beings are not shut in, enclosed subjects, split off from the world. But he is basing himself on Heidegger, that we're always already in the world, being in the world with other people, and that any concept of mind or inner world or something like that is a derived speculation hateful to Heidegger and to Boss. They start from our being in the world with others. This is what we're given. This is what we're born into. And the rest is so much nonsense. I mean, this is the basic, what I found very refreshing, new starting point of Daseinsanalysis. Dasein is Heidegger's word for what a human being is. We are the Sein, which means being, of the there, or the there of being. We are, each of us is a sort of a happening where being happens, and and our task, as it were, is to meditate on this amazing fact and what being is. I mean, Heidegger's whole lifelong project, which started when he was 19, was when one of his teachers lent him or gave him a book by the Jewish philosopher Brentano called The Manifold Meanings of Being in Aristotle. And Heidegger was fascinated by this book. There are basically about 4 different meanings of being that Aristotle studied. Heidegger thought, but surely there must be one central meaning of being, that these other 4 aspects of being are aspects of. And he made that his single lifelong project. He called it sort of aiming at a star. the star was to find the meaning of being, the central meaning of being. Now, of course, if he'd had a chat with Wittgenstein might have said, well, Heidegger, I've written about things like that. I've written about, for example, games. Right at the beginning of my philosophical investigations, I ask, just because we have all sorts of different games, different kinds of games, is there a sort of essence of game that is common to all of them? And I argue, no, there isn't. They're more like a family with family resemblances, and you can see that people are members of the same family, but it doesn't mean they've all got one thing in common, like a beaky nose or blue eyes or something. But nevertheless, you could still see that it's obvious these people belong to one family because there's a sort of shifting and there's a sort of interplay of different relationships between different subsets of the family. And why? So Wittgenstein, I'm sure, would have said, Heidegger, your star may be such an illusion. Maybe there is no central meaning of being. And oddly enough, I may not be well read enough, but I've never come across anybody criticizing Heidegger's lifelong project on those grounds. I don't know whether Wittgenstein realized that that was Heidegger's project, but he certainly never commented on it. And I've never seen anybody actually criticize Heidegger on that sort of Wittgensteinian ground. But this, anyway, this is the sort of basis of Daseinsanalysis, the analysis of Dasein, this that we are creatures whose, as Heidegger says, our very being, or we are beings whose being is in question for us. We differ even from other animals. I mean, many people have argued with him about the radical distinction between other animals and us, but Heidegger had gone into that at great length, actually, in some of his lectures, going into great detail about bumblebees and lots of different sorts of creature, and he reaches the conclusion that despite all the similarities with other creatures, we are unique in that we are beings whose being is in question to itself, and our sort of task is to understand the meaning of being. Now, when Boss, as I say, says it couldn't be said that our dreamer belonged to the shut-in, retiring type of human being, that's a mistranslation, because what Boss is actually saying is that none of us belong to the shut-in. It's nothing to do with being retiring. It's none of us are shut in, enclosed entities with an inner world and an outer world, like Melanie Klein or somebody talks about. From Heidegger's and Boss's point of view, this is nonsense. This is a horribly destructive way of approaching human beings. And so he tries to start understanding what the dream could mean if we don't start from this alienated, reifying assumption of what this desecration of what human beings are, which is the starting point, as they see it, of Freud's and Jung's and Klein's, you name it, dream theories. All the dream theories of the 20th century, Boss throws out. Although he says that each of them may have some value, a limited value, and indeed there may be some people that they may be appropriate for, because those people are simply not ready. They are simply not ready to face the full reality of what being human is or means. So that for those people, it may actually be a good kind of kindergarten for dream analysis if they start off with Freud or Jung or Klein. But from his point of view, this is still childish, and this is not recognizing the full majesty of not just human beings, but the full majesty of being. I mean, for example, in Boss's second book on dreams, which he published about 20 years later, called I Dreamt Last Night, although in German it says es träumte mir the sort of it dreamt to me last night, which Boss thinks is a more appropriate way of talking about dreams. That I dreamt sounds more egoic, as if I was doing it, but he prefers the German way in which the dream sort of speaks to us. In that book, an early chapter simply asks, what is a dog? If one dreams about a dog, is this dog a symbol of animality, a symbol of somebody's father, or a symbol of this or that? And he says in all this chatter about what a dog may symbolize, the dog has got lost, and then he expounds poetically, for page after page, the full magnificence of what an actual dog is. The dog stands there on his 4 feet and faces the world, and it was born out of another dog, and is interested in cats, up trees. He just makes you feel what an astounding miracle a dog is. The full reality of a dog. And he says, why would anyone want to reduce this dog to a dream symbol? Why do we start ruining our dreams by trying to flatten them out into symbols? Of course, his understanding of symbol is, I must say, a rather flattening out kind of notion of symbol. I think there's another way of thinking about symbolism which doesn't have to flatten out in that way. But nevertheless, this is how he and Heidegger appear to, well, certainly Boss, and everything Boss writes, he more or less gets the approval of Heidegger for. So I think we can take it that they're agreed that about this sort of flattening out, reductive nature of most of 20th century writing on dreams. And so what really took my fancy in this book, when he wrote about this woman dreaming about the rainbow bridges and the dream urn, she told us that at the time of her dream, her heart and soul were as open as the mouth of the dream urn, and that she was as bound by deep affection to her family as the rainbow bridge in the dream had seemed to bind them to one another. Was she right, in fact? Were the dream urn and the dream bridge merely symbols and representations in the form of images of her inner subjective disposition? Could not both urn and bridge be considered as objects in themselves? By what right do dream psychologists, whom this woman is merely copying in her waking judgment about these dream objects, deny the fact that they are objects in themselves and interpret them as mere symbols projected by the dreamer's psyche? What if there are no dream symbols at all? That's the central question of this book. And that is what interested me about Daseinsanalysis, and I've never lost that interest and that initial sort of excitement of being challenged by this question: what if there are no dream symbols at all? But then, if there are not, what is there? Well, Boss says, okay, there's no dream symbols, but there's the dream. You dream about a dog, and you're not allowed to find what the dog is a symbol of, and so you feel disappointed. Well, how ridiculous. You've got the dog in all this magnificence, her magnificence. What, just think about what is a dog in all its grandeur. And he gives he tries to make his point by saying, well, what is a bridge? The woman dreams about a rainbow bridge, and urn on the bridges, he says, what is the original full reality of a bridge and an urn? And this is what he says. And again, this made a big impression on my youthful mind. This is my, early 20s. Before I actually became a therapist. So, how do these things, a bridge and an urn, for instance, appear to us directly, either in our waking or our dreaming world, if we do not previously dissect them into mere objects of utility? Now he gives quite a long quotation, which I'll read you, because this is part of what impressed me. So he's asking, what are a bridge and an urn? First, the bridge. A bridge swings easily and strongly above the stream. It does more than connect existing banks. Only in the crossing of a bridge do banks emerge as banks. The bridge separates them. It opposes one side to the other. Nor are banks the indifferent boundaries between firm land and stream. The bridge connects river and bank, now with one and then with another inland stretch. It brings river, bank, and land into mutual proximity. The bridge gathers the land as a landscape around the stream. It thus guides the stream through the fields. Its pillars, resting on the river bed, support the curved arches which leave free path for the waters of the stream. No matter if these waters travel peacefully or in agitation, no matter if heavenly floods during thunderstorms or during the melting of snow rush in great waves about the pillar's arches, the bridge is ready for every kind of weather and for its vagaries. Where the bridge spans the stream, it withholds its flow from the heavens by receiving it for a moment under its arches before freeing it once more. While giving the stream full rein, it yet enables us mortals to go on our way from land to land. Bridges guide us in many ways. The town bridge leads from the castle to the cathedral square. The river bridge outside the town guides carriages and horses to surrounding villages. The modest old stone bridge gives free passage to harvest wagons from meadows and fields, and guides the wooden cart from field path to main road. A highway bridge is an essential part of speedy motor traffic. Always and in different ways, the bridge guides the hesitant and hasty steps of men so that they may reach the other bank and finally, as mortals, the other side. The bridge swings, here with high and there with shallow arches, across rivers and clefts. Whether we mortals remember the spanning nature of the bridge or whether we forget it, we're always on our way to the last bridge. For in ever trying to transcend our meanness and our wickedness, we are trying to reach the sanctity of the divine. The bridge gathers us, and in crossing it, we're brought before the divine. Whether this fact be especially remembered, and we openly offer thanks for it, as in the figure of the bridge saint, or whether it be concealed or even pushed out of mind. So, does anybody recognize this passage about a bridge? It's actually by Heidegger from his essay Bauen, Wohnen, Denken, which means building, dwelling, thinking, which was a lecture he gave in 1950. And architects actually have, because it talks about building, including building of bridges, architects have, many architects in many countries have actually been very influenced by this essay about the fundamental nature of buildings, including bridges. Okay, so this is the so-called full reality of a bridge. And then Boss says, now, what is the full and original reality of the thing which we call a golden urn? According to Pindar, ancient Greek poet, in its gold, the most glorious and the mightiest of earthly treasures, Thea, the Godhead herself, is reflected. It's wide open to the heavens. Its empty shell is ready to receive all that heaven and earth have grown and what has sprung from them. Yet it contains what it's received only in order to bring divine gifts to man, or man's offerings to the gods. It contains our daily bread, or it becomes a sacrificial vessel. For the undistorted view, both urn and bridge reveal all this content and meaning originally and quite by themselves, only because these things themselves originally comprise all these characteristics, and because bridge and urn are inherently the assembly of heaven and earth, of the divine and the human, can we speak of them as things. For in contradistinction to the word object, even today the word which in northern lands etymologically corresponds to thing means assembly. I mean, it's true in English and in German, Ding. They were words used for assembly and courts of justice. In olden times, it particularly referred to the courts of justice in which assemblies declared what was right and true. For this reason, the common positivist dismissal of this essence of objects as mere romantic adornments due to muddle-headed and unscientific thinking cannot touch its reality at all. Rather, the immediate and full experience of a thing demonstrates how terribly restrictive is the positivistic point of view. So that is, I mean, that is the sort of quintessence of Bossian Heideggerian Daseinsanalysis. It's that somehow we can be in touch with the full reality of being, or beings, of bridges and urns and dogs and cats and snakes and human beings and so on, and it needs no symbolism, that they're already overflowing with meaning, and we don't have to project meanings into them as if they're kind of dead entities, dead objects, which have to be sort of brought alive by our empathy. One of Heidegger's one of the things that I like best myself about Heidegger's big book, Being and Time, is his attack on empathy. As far as he's concerned, empathy is a degenerate concept, fit only for degenerate creatures, degenerate beings, because only a degenerate being which was cut off from other people would have to engage in empathy, kind of trying to, and empathy is, it's a neologism. I mean, in German it's einfühlen, feeling in. And it was, the very concept was invented by art theoretician, psychologist Lips, invented the German word einfühlen, which means, translated as empathy. And the idea is that if we want to understand a work of art, we project our feelings into the work of art, as it were, to bring this dead, painted canvas to life. Well, to Heidegger, this is a hideous, horrible idea, because from his point of view, the painting is the expression of truth. He talks about the truth of the painting, and our task is not to project our feelings into it and to bring this dead paint to life. Our task is to be open to the reality of and the truth of the painting. And similarly, if I want to respect you or understand you, it's absurd for me to start projecting my feelings experimentally into you to see if they correspond to your behavior, so that then I can work out that I have correctly assessed what you may be feeling. But I mean, and here both Heidegger and Wittgenstein are as one. Both of them say, if you are angry, I can see this immediately. I don't have to infer it from your behavior. I see it, it's not split off in this sort of alienated way. course, I can be mistaken. I can be mistaken that you're angry, just as I can be mistaken about the color of your hair if I see you from a certain perspective or something like that, or I can misjudge your height. It doesn't mean that I see you perfectly, but nevertheless, I do experience. I mean, this is what Heidegger and Boss mean by phenomenology. Phenomenology is the logos means discourse, the word, reason. Phenomenon is what appeared, and so phenomenology is the sort of reason or the logic, as it were, of what appears, and what appears is not a mere appearance of something behind the appearance, which is the reality, as in Kant, but what appears is, in a sense, all that there is. But of course, what the phenomenon, what there is, only reveals now this aspect and now that aspect, and is always concealed part of itself, just like the moon only reveals to us one face at a time. So the very concept of phenomenology is to do with conversation, logos, which somehow enables us to be in touch with what is appearing to us. But the very concept of conversation, to me, implies, well, a conversation, not an inner, not a sort of inner dialogue of one person, but an inter-Daseins, interpersonal exploration. Anyway, so I mean, I've tried to present to you this, what I regard as the sort of traditional, which is quite a revolutionary aspect or nature of Daseinsanalysis. But once one's got over the initial refreshment of it, then certain questions arise. And this is the other side of it, which I would like also to present to you tonight, because does this not encourage the idea that an analyst, who would call himself a Daseinsanalyst, presents himself as an expert on being and on Dasein and on what is the real nature, for example, of a bridge? I mean, you and I may actually quarrel about what is the real nature of a bridge. Any of us may disagree with that description by Heidegger of a bridge, for example. And is there not the danger that the Daseinsanalyst presents him or herself as the authority who has unmediated access to the phenomenon, which it is his or her task to teach to the poor screwed up client or patient, as they call them, they still call them, who is seeing symbolism or thinking reductively and so on. And this is, I mean, this danger is not just a theoretical one. I mean, for example, in 1992, my good friend John Conrad, who is now dead, bless him, he was Meadow-Boss's successor, but he came all the way to London to a conference at Regent's College, sort of centered on him, and he told a dream about a woman who dreamt walking along a path, and she met a woman, and her analyst said, so, well, what about this woman? And it was an unknown woman. And the dreaming woman said, well, perhaps the woman stands for my analyst's wife. And Conrad said, you see, this is the traditional sort of nonsense you get. The woman herself has been corrupted by psychological dream theories. No, it is quite clear what the dreamer is really encountering. She is encountering woman, sort of the essence of woman. And a existential therapist called Sarah Young challenged her and said, but surely it's for the dreamer to end up deciding what her dream means. And Conrad was scandalized, and he said, no, if we would let the dreamer decide what her dream means, we would just have a psychologistic, subjectivistic Daseinsanalysis, and this would not do at all. So he was definitely claiming that the Daseinsanalyst is the one who has the access to the true meaning of the dream. And as a matter of fact, I went to a lecture by somebody who had been in charge of the advanced diploma of existential psychotherapy in Regent's College for many years, giving a lecture at the Society for Existential Analysis. And the lecture was going through Freud, then Jung, and then Boss, and their theories of dreams. And the lecturer had got it exactly the one way around. The lecturer claimed that Freud and Jung had their theories of dreams, which they imposed on the dreamer, and they told the dreamer what they meant, whereas Boss invited the dreamer to think what was the meaning of their own dream. This is exactly the one way around. It is, I'm afraid, the way that I've put it, that Boss does come along, and Conrad does come along, and dismiss the dreamer's humble attempts to find a meaning in their dream, unless they happen to coincide with the true way of seeing, which is the Heideggerian, Bossian way of seeing the real meaning of the original, authentic meaning of a bridge or an urn or a dog or whatever it is. So this original what I found refreshing idea that just letting a bridge be a bridge or a cigar be a cigar or whatever it is, has definitely got some dubious aspects, is it not? And so in recent years, I've been looking at, trying to figure out the history of Daseinsanalysis and what has gone wrong there. What has gone wrong that something that is sort of potentially liberating has turned into, like so many other disciplines or pseudo-disciplines, has turned into something that first seems liberating, has turned into yet another, at its worst, sort of dreary application of dogma. And just to show you how dogmatic it has been, I think it still functions like this, I'm not quite sure. But I mean, for decades in Zurich, in the Daseinsanalytic Institute, the trainee Daseinsanalyst had to do an examination in dream, the understanding of dreams. And they were given a dream, and they were told the age and the sex of the dreamer. They were told nothing else. And then they had to write their interpretation of the dream, or their analysis, or their I'm not quite sure which word. The word that Boss uses is actually Auslegung, which means something like literally sort of laying out, letting the dream speak for itself. But they could be marked right or wrong. And I mean, there was a Greek Daseinsanalyst who joked that he had written his dream analysis, and Conrad said, "Well, you passed." And Conrad said, "Well, I knew what you would want me to, how you would want me to write about the dream, so I wrote what I thought you would want." And so, of course, I've passed. How have we got into this situation? I mean, what is there that is valid and good in this revolutionary approach of Boss's, or is the whole thing invalid? I mean, is the whole idea of there being the original full reality of a bridge, is that whole idea in itself something simply perverted and destructive and wrong? I've talked for quite a while. I'll just give you a few hints at the direction in which I've taken my questioning. I went back and looked at Heidegger's whole approach. One of the things which I find very dubious in Daseinsanalysis. I should explain. I'm actually the only certified Daseinsanalyst in Britain. So I know as much about Daseinsanalysis as the average Daseinsanalyst knows. I'm qualified to criticize it, and I do criticize it. I criticize this sort of absolutism and this attitude of superiority to the client. In practice, lots of the Daseinsanalysts are very lovable and loving people who have very gentle, admirable approaches to their, I would call, clients, and some of them would still call patients. I find them actually much more likable than most psychotherapists. I don't like most psychotherapists, quite honestly. But this, and many of them would agree with me about this absolutism which threatens a good idea. So, what have I discovered in going back over the history of Daseinsanalysis to find out how this idea of the sort of absolute authority of the analyst has come about? And going back to Heidegger, looking over his writings from his earliest lectures, 1919, to his very last seminar in 1973, there's one thing that he constantly attacks, which hasn't really come into the focus of most people yet. What he attacks is dialectic. And from the very beginning, for example, in Being and Time, he says dialectics is a real philosophical embarrassment. And in papers, in lectures from 1923, he gets really animated about dialectic, and he calls it something like a madame for the public whoring of the spirit. And then right towards the end of his life, he attacks dialectic again. Over and over again, he attacks it as something which is opposed to phenomenology. Now, the tradition I come from, Langenester and Szasz and so on, treats dialectics and phenomenology as, well, lovers. They are married together. If you study what I think is one of the great books of the 20th century, which I've done a lot of research on, which is Langenester's Sanity, Madness, and the Family. This is a book which is openly indebted to Sartre's philosophy, critique of dialectical reason, but it also claims to be phenomenology, social phenomenology. They see no conflict. They think that these two are essentially the same. So what has happened with Heidegger, that he has split them off and is denouncing dialectic? Now, very, very, very early in Heidegger's writings, in 1919, I just came across a word which he threw out. It wasn't even in his written text for his lectures. We're indebted to the philosopher Oskar Becker, who became a famous sort of existential mathematical philosopher, and also a noted Nazi later on. Becker wrote that Heidegger said philosophical dialectic is Diahermeneutics. And that's all it says. And this has been conscientiously, this sort of little note by Becker has been conscientiously recorded in the book of transcripts of Heidegger's lectures from 1919, right at the beginning of his career. Heidegger, as far as we can see, never ever used that word, diahermeneutics, ever again. but when I saw it, I thought that's a great word. I mean, it's, you could say it's, well, psychotherapy is full of long, pompous words. We could do without another one, but this one seemed to me a really good one because it seemed to describe exactly what I am doing. What I do as a therapist is, I hope, is diahermeneutics. It's a dialogue in which together we struggle to interpret, to make sense of what's going on. And so my project for the last few years has been to, as it were, try to renew Daseinsanalysis, to get beyond this absolutism and this authoritarianism in which the analyst is in touch with the phenomena and has to teach this in touchness to the client, to transform it into diahermeneutics, which is a conjoint investigation and adventure and journey in which I don't have access to phenomena which I impart to the client, but we struggle together through dialogue towards interpretations. We may not end up agreeing, but we may somehow together work towards some sort of understanding, some sort of interpretation, provisional. This is my this is really how I practice. I mean, I haven't really said anything detailed about how I practice, but I hope this corresponds to what I actually in practice do. And so now I'd like to know what you think about it. Oh, but by the way, Del did ask me to mention one thing, which I forgot to mention, and that is, I understand some of you you didn't study this book on dreams, but you studied Boss's book, Psychoanalysis and Daseinsanalysis in English, which begins with this patient of his, as he calls her, Dr. Cobbling. How many of you did that? Yeah. And the title of the chapter is, I think it's a patient who taught the author to think and practice differently. Something like that is the title. And that in itself is a rather dishonest title, because he presents it as though I mean, at the time I identified and researched this particular patient, this woman. I mean, I've made it my business throughout my career as a therapist to research a number of paradigm cases, like Freud's main cases, and some Jungians, and a couple of Bosses, and one of Melanie Klein's, and so on. And so I made it my business to identify this woman, whose pseudonym is Dr. Cobbling, and she, I'm happy to say, does actually confirm most of what he writes, and she says she really was profoundly helped by him. But there's one thing about his presentation which is done, I don't know, for didactic purposes or whatever. He says that she taught him to see and think differently. I mean, the fact is that by the time he was teaching her, he'd already written a number of books on Daseinsanalysis, and he'd been collaborating with Heidegger for well over a decade. And so he's presenting it as if this woman sort of awakened him out of his psychiatric slumbers. Well, this is just a kind of didactic way of presenting it, which simply isn't true. And Boss did tell a number of tall stories which one has to watch out for. But on the other hand, Dr. Cobbling did say that the basic truth is that he did profoundly help her, and she went on to have a satisfying career as a sculptor. She was deeply grateful to him. Okay, over to you.
Thank you. So any comments, questions? People online or people in the room?
I think I might have, if that's okay. I was really appreciative for how nuanced you provided that, because I was under the impression that the Dasein analysis of dreams was not going to be the absolutist thing that you maybe revealed it or explained it to be, but was going to be something more collaborative, exploring what the meanings of that object were with individuals. And I find that really captivating. And yeah, I still find myself really still excited by symbolism and what the individuals think about the symbolism of objects, which maybe it stands in contrast to that. And I know, I have, from what I understand, Jung was more in that vein, like he'd collaborate, find the symbolism of what the client thought about the dream sometimes. But I can imagine it would be quite tempting to bring a hodgepodge into practice between the two, because one's individual ideas of the full meaning of the object or being in the dream might like dance between symbolism and what we think of that object. How in your practice do you feel about that? Do you kind of throw out symbolism completely? And what happens if the client brings up symbolism?
Well, I mean, when I started out as a psychotherapist, this was even after, some years after I'd actually read this and been inspired by it. You know, my first reading and absorption was Freud, and then I'd also read some Jung, and I found it very, very tempting to show how clever I was to my clients by throwing out interpretations, whether they were Freudian or Jungian or whatever. And so it's incredibly easy to do. It's incredibly easy to seduce your clients into thinking what a brilliant therapist you are, you know. And then I really started feeling a bit ashamed of myself, and you know, remembered what Boss had said, and I actually found it much more helpful simply to stand back and refrain a bit and just let the person sort of dwell with the dream. But of course, as Boss says, the clients do tend, I mean, the clients vary enormously, but some of them do tend to come along and do exactly what Boss describes, which is they bring a dream, for example. And I mean, this doesn't only apply to dreams, it applies to the whole of life, but let's, you know, take dream as a sort of paradigm, as Freud and Boss are both doing. A client may well come along and tell a dream and then start sort of doing it to death by seeing it as a symbol. And so there may well be an occasion when I will gently sort of say, you know, but you didn't actually dream about. I mean, just you didn't actually dream about a penis. You dreamt about a cigar, and you know, you could have dreamt about anything that could be a symbol for penis. So, but there's nothing in what you've said that's really actually got anything to do with what you dreamt about, which was a cigar. And so in that respect, Boss is extremely helpful. But going beyond that to say what is the original full reality of a cigar, I think that is a step too far. That I mean, what he is really doing there is actually replacing his patient's associations with his own associations, which are Heidegger's associations, and there's nothing actually privileged about Heidegger's thinking about what a bridge is over anybody else. So, and the other paradoxical thing is that most people don't realize, I don't know how many of you realize, Freud's original theory. I mean, I told you about this person who was lecturing at the Society for Existential Analysis and misleading people by saying that Freud and Jung sort of laid down, you know, their theory and they would tell the patient what the dream meant. But I mean, as a matter of fact, it was the exact opposite. Freud said that his method of interpreting dreams was the first method in which the dream interpreter didn't claim to know what the dream meant in advance. And he actually says, not in the dream book, but in a later paper, he says, if somebody tells us something and we don't understand quite what he's saying, what do? We say, well, we ask him to explain what he means. And why don't we just do the same with dreams? And then he says, that's basically all I do. I don't know what the person's dream means. I ask him or her what it means. And that's the essence of my dream theory. And there's very little symbolism in the first edition of the Interpretation of Dreams, 1899. It's 10 years later in the second edition, Stekel has written his own book on dreams, which is full of dream symbolism. And so Freud just felt a bit jealous because Stekel was doing quite well, and so he didn't want to be outdone. So he then said, well actually, although in my first edition I was lukewarm about symbolism, it's perfectly true that there are certain and the reason for that is because even when symbolism does occur, it's it can be the person's individual symbolism, and it's very dubious, and it's a very sort of dubious step to take to start talking about universal dream symbolisms or dictionaries of symbols, which is exactly what he had been putting down in the first chapter of the Interpretation of Dreams. He was against all the traditional theories of dreams, which were sort of magical and which would give you dictionaries of symbols. That's exactly what he was against. But most people nowadays think people very, very rarely read Freud or Jung. They read stupid books about them, and they don't know about them. And Freud said that his was the first theory of dreams in which the interpreter didn't claim to understand the meaning of the dream, but asked the dreamer. And he asked the dreamer the associations. Well, that sounds a rather sort of, clinical psychology, sort of natural scientific sort of thing to do. What he actually asked them, what falls in? I mean, that's a very phenomenological, existential, Heideggerian sort of way of thinking. In thinking about your dream, what falls into your awareness, sort of as you dwell on your dream. That's what has been kind of reified into this so-called psychological method of dream associations. And Boss talked quite rightly about how you could ask somebody to free associate to their dream, and their associations lead you here and here and here, and you've got completely away from the dream itself. Boss is always talking about the dream itself that one shouldn't ignore. And I still think that this is the sort of authentic core which shouldn't be thrown out of Boss. It's when he extends that into claiming that sort of in effect he or the analyst has got this kind of authentic, unmediated access to the actual.
Do you think there'd be something helpful in the idea of thinking about dreams as a form of poetics, so that rather than this idea of interpretation and truths, that I thought Rogers facilitating an environment, and I thought the same with free association, that you can provide a sort of environment that allows someone to understand dreams almost like a poem, how it moves you, how you interact with it, but the words are there. So you have this almost poetic sense that it's not concrete, it's not absolute, but it meanders and it moves around. And I'm thinking about Heidegger's later work in terms of how that might be more helpful in dreams.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, certainly. And not just dreams, just anything a person says.
It seems it's this idea of truth and getting to the absoluteness that seems to get everybody down the garden path somewhere.
Oh, but the truth doesn't. The truth doesn't have to be absolute. People who surely people who say there is no truth are up the creek. At least they are, as far as I'm concerned. But the people who claim to be in touch with absolute truth are also up the creek. Both, but that doesn't mean that it makes no sense to talk about truth. So I do think that I do see the Daseinsanalyst and the analysand, horrible word. That sounds as if the analysand is being analysed by the analyst. This is the other thing. When I started out as a therapist, when I started training, actually, the first, I remember clearly, I was going to my first seminar with John Heaton on phenomenology. And we spent the whole first term reading Husserl's Encyclopedia Britannica article on phenomenology. And I remember thinking, what sort of therapist, did I want to be when I started actually practicing as a therapist? And I thought, well, I don't want to be a directive therapist, but nor do I want to be a non-directive therapist. I thought, well, what do I want to be? And the best I could think at the time was, well, I want to be direct. But that didn't seem adequate. When I woke up this morning, I thought, well, I've got to come, to Dell's group in the evening, and I've got to say something. What on earth am I going to say? And then I remembered this thing about directive and non-directive, and I'd like to be direct. And I thought, well, the direct is only a sort of step in the way of what I want to be. And then I thought about the actual word direct, and it's rather sinister in certain ways, because it contains the word doctor, and it contains ECT, and you split it up into I and doctor and ECT, which is hardly what I was aspiring to be. So I think that it's probably to throw it out altogether. Essentially, what I want to do as a therapist is simply to start with the fact that somebody has come to me asking me for some sort of help with some sort of problem. So the first question is, does this make any sense? Do I think that I'll say, well, why did you come to me, and why did you think I might be able to help you? And if they tell me about certain problems, and it seems to me that I might be able to help them in some way, then I'll just say that, and I'll say, okay, well, maybe I think I might be able to help you. So shall we continue meeting? But I don't actually apply any existing theory. I'm aware of the philosophy and my sort of conception coming from people like Heidegger of what human beings are and how they shouldn't be reduced in this depraved sort of psychologistic way. But this is a kind of negative sort of safeguarding net, as it were, for what is going on. But I really don't know what is going to go on in this conversation between us. And I say very little usually, although sometimes there will be occasions when I say quite a lot, but most of it will be responding to what the person is saying that they are trying to discover or find out. And I will probably pay attention to certain discrepancies or apparent contradictions in what they say and gently point these out. But I won't actually.
Is that a theory?
It is a sort of theory, yes. It seems pretty minimalist. It's I mean, I certainly don't help. I don't promise to help them achieve what they have said they wanted to achieve in the first session. I usually will make the reservation that I think I might be able to help them, but the help that I might give might not be the sort of help that they were hoping for. It might, because it might seem, I might actually say this in the first session, it might seem to me that the way you have defined your goal or your problem might turn out in itself to be a problem. I mean, through our conversation, it might emerge that you yourself come to see something contradictory or something self-defeating or something foolish even in the original thing you wanted to solve. And so, you know, so you may come to see the problem as the way you define the problem. So I suppose that's the sort of minimal theory that I have, together with this background idea of essentially what human beings are. That human beings are not what they are as described by, really, they can't be reduced to what Freud says a human being is, or
They'd be reduced to what Heidegger says a human being.
no. Except that Heidegger has got a kind of inbuilt openness, so that, but except that he reduces what is possible by this attack on dialectic. He's betraying this original definition of phenomenology, which inherently is dialectical. He actually says it's logos, which discourse in approaching what appears. It's a collaborative effort, and I mean this failure in Heidegger is, I mean, in a sense, it's. I mean, to take Heidegger as the sort of golden touch on psychotherapy, as Boss does, you know, in the Solomon seminars and the Daseinsanalyst, is a very dangerous, tricky thing to do. I mean, even if you go back to Heidegger's own family, I mean, I actually know some of his family members, and they've described what went on in his family. And indeed, dialectic was not his forte. His ultimate ideal seemed to be silence when the problems arose. I mean, to take a concrete example, his second son, Hermann, who became a lawyer. He devoted his life to his father's work, you know, in an admirable way. But when he was 14, he was told by his mother that Heidegger was not, in fact, his father. But she made him swear never to tell anybody except his future wife about this. Now, I mean, coming from a Lang and Esterson family way of seeing families, I mean, can I ask any of you, what effect do you think that might have on a young man of 14 being told that the father, who no doubt was a very kindly, decent sort of father, as far as I can tell, you know, to his two sons, but that being told that your father is not your father, but you mustn't raise the matter with him. You must swear never to tell anybody except your future wife. What effect do you think that would have on a 14-year-old boy? Yes, I suppose you can't generalize, but
you know, isn't that something about what we're saying? Is that what's it to him? You know, what is it to the person that we can speculate, we can imagine? we can extrapolate from fantasy about what it's like. But what is it to him?
Well, he did say, he did in fact, I mean, he asked his, what's her relation to him? His niece, he asked his niece, Gertrude, who brought out an edition of Heidegger's letters to his wife. He asked whether he could make a statement at the end of her book, and he did. And he said, my Gertrude has kindly allowed me to make a statement, and this statement is that Heidegger was not my father. My mother told me when I was 14 and made me promise never to tell anyone but my future wife. And this has been a terrible burden for me all my life.
We might have guessed that, but he said it.
He actually said it, and it's not even clear from what she says or what he says. It's not actually clear whether Heidegger himself knew, and it's not clear whether he knew whether his father knew. It's not even clear whether he knew whether his brother knew, and it's not clear whether he knew whether his brother knew that he now knew. It's not clear whether his father now knows that he now knows. I mean, if you start thinking about it in a Lang and Esterson sort of way, just remember Lang's The Self and Others, P's perspective on O's perspective on P. What I think about you, what you think about me, and what I think about what you think about me, and so on. Those peanut cartoons which Lang liked to use, with those sort of crazy things. But those crazy things are what we're all thinking about and concerned about all the time. The things that go on around family breakfast tables and dinner tables and so on. These are the things, this is the sort of heart of a great deal of the problems that people come to me with. And I don't see how they can be understood, really, by Daseinsanalysts unless they actually make a study of it. They don't talk about down-to-earth things like double binds and mystification and invalidation in families. They talk in cliches about, they say she came from a typical traditional Swiss puritanical family. This is the sort of generalization they will give about people's family backgrounds. They don't go into the dialectics of it, the detailed dialectics of what did Hermann think his father thought about this, if he knew about it, but did he know about it, and so on. Now, he actually did elaborate it on a little bit in a newspaper interview, which I found online, where he actually did say, he said quite explicitly that his father had never ever mentioned it to him. So the two of them died without ever having mentioned the fact. And I mean, we do know, in fact, that Heidegger did know that he wasn't the biological father. So the two of them lived and died in close proximity with each other. And Hermann devoted his life to his non-father's work and reputation and posterity and so on, without the two of them ever acknowledging in any way that the one who called himself the son of the other was actually not the son of the other. I mean, you can say he was the existential son, but it clearly mattered to Hermann that he was not the biological son. And he says it was a terrible burden. He didn't say it was a terrible burden that he was not the biological son. What he said it was a terrible burden that he had been seduced into. I mean, he could have refused to make that promise, but he was seduced by his mother into making it. And having made it, he was honourable enough never to break it, and until he made the statement, quite some time after his mother had died. Horrible thing. And I mean, I spoke to the granddaughter herself about how Heidegger's sort of preferred mode of dealing with dialogue seemed to be, even in the dialogues that he wrote. I mean, he did write a number of dialogues, like in his book Galassi, sort of a walk on a country path, a dialogue between a teacher and a scientist and philosopher, something like this. His dialogues usually end in a row of dots. and silence, which is too profound for words. And this seems to be Heidegger's preferred way of dealing with difficulties. I mean, obviously books have been written. I mean, there's a book called, at least one book called Heidegger's Silence, meaning Heidegger's silence about his Nazi time. So Heidegger's solution to difficulties too often is silence, and this seems to be not a good lesson to transmit to budding Daseinsanalysts.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because there's always that gap that we fill up, with some totalitarian theory, which perhaps comes from our own fascism. Things that I'm reminded of when we were speaking of ideas of that people can't say the word, deterritorialize something, and then re-territorialize it. This is something I was looking at earlier this week at Deleuze and Guattari, anti-Oedipus, and they're saying that Freud helped to understand the psyche. He revolutionized it with the concepts of libido and polymorphous perversity. But he then, after a little bit, which you could read phenomenologically, say, he then sort of brings in the conceptualization of a new territory of the Oedipus complex. Yeah? And I think you're saying that Boss was able, I think, whilst he was, I think, briefly in analysis with Freud, he because he worked for so long with Jung, he could see there was another way of going about things that was a little bit different. And he deterritorialized. But the problem you're brought to our attention is he's re-territorialized. He re-territorialized it in a different way.
Yeah.
And how can we keep this open? How can we stop that circle being closed up with some theorizing? Yeah, that then becomes dogma.
Yes, and I mean, it should be emphasized that Boss did not sort of throw out Freud and Jung altogether. He had the greatest respect for Freud. He was a great teller of tall stories. His deputy Kondraw doubted whether he'd ever actually been to Freud, but I believe he had been to Freud, but he just exaggerated how long he'd been. but he said that Freud, he could never forget Freud's wonderful eyes, and he gives so many detailed descriptions of sort of personal things Freud did against the rules that it must be true. He was amazed that Freud didn't obey his own rules. And a friend of mine, Alice Watruba, who was analyzed by Boss, says that Boss's main concern for his trainees was that they should read Freud's papers on technique. That was more important even than reading Heidegger and so on, because he thought that Freud's actual practice was much, much better than his theories.
Well, I think that's what certainly we're trying, perhaps you're trying, is to look at phenomenology and exercise. Maybe first, and then look at some implications of psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I mean, that's a different way around from the one I came to it from. But,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, can we thank Anthony very much indeed?
I haven't got to know you. I do apologize. I haven't encouraged discussion.
Well, we've got a few minutes in the break to talk. Thank you for coming. Can I just say that we also, our next speaker is actually this Saturday, Helen Douglas, and she is talking about to change our thinking, philosophical practice for difficult times. So that's our next speaker. That's Saturday, 10 to 11:30, and on the Thursday, it's on the 7th of September when it's Manu Pisano, talking about the skull beneath the skin, death, suicide, and existential therapy. That's something to look forward to. Thank you very much, and thank you all very much again for attending.